All right, so now we're recording. So a bunch of things I wanted to talk about. I guess I was thinking I would just lay out a couple of those things that I think might be interesting to explore, and then maybe you could lay out a couple of things that you'd like to talk about, and then we'll just jump into it. Um, Given some of our time constraints, I would say I think the main things I'm interested in focusing on are partly some of the ongoing conversations that Vervaeke and Pageau have been having around the idea of collective intelligence, especially commentary on their latest video. I thought some of the things you had to say about it were very interesting, so I think we'll dive into those a little bit in more detail. And then also um, the relationship of those ideas to the imaginal, um, as it's sort of expressed in the work of Henri Corbin, and how that maybe fits into, I guess, some of these evolving cultural spaces, both in person and on the internet, and our kind of understanding of the sacred and the divine in relationship to these things. I think that's an area of great interest for me, something I'm actively exploring and that I'm also trying to write about as well. So I think that might be a good place to sort of start. But before we jump into that, I'm wondering if there's other things you'd like to talk about in addition to that.
Yeah, all of those, you basically covered everything I had in my notes, largely in response to the Corbin article on the Imaginal world, and bringing in some of the stuff from the Center for the Study of Digital Life, and then the Vervaeke and Pageau conversation. Yeah, that's basically everything I have.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think I'll just assume for the sake of people who are watching, most people will have some familiarity with the idea of the imaginal, but I think we'll just kind of summarize it so we're both on the same page and that anyone who might be watching is also understanding where we're coming from, what we're talking about. So, I mean, I guess the imaginal was sort of an idea that was explicated by a philosopher and a theologian by the name of Henri Corbin. And it's sort of described in distinction to other ideas. And so in our culture, we have an idea about things that are like imaginary. When you think of something imaginary is something that, like, you know, perhaps when you're daydreaming, or perhaps when you're thinking intentionally, your ego mind is creating ideas, and you're chaining associations together, or chaining images, sensations, thoughts, and you're putting them together into new gestalts. And that's kind of like what imagination is, or what the imaginary is. So, it's kind of the work that any creative author of fiction does, is, they deal in the realm of the imaginary. The imaginal is quite different in the sense that what it proposes is um, it's similar to the imaginary in the sense that you're delving into inner experience, and so it's encountered on the plane of the mind, sort of innerly, in an inner sense. But the imaginal is something more like an intermediate zone, if you will, between what is imaginary, so what is kind of created whole cloth from the fabric of the ego or the unconscious in a like deliberate or an intentional sense, and I guess something that is a little bit more like a dialogue perhaps between different parts of the self. That's at least how I understand the imaginal on a surface level, and I'm sure we can delve into it. But if you want to add anything to that, I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, I actually like that definition, although I got the impression more, maybe he speaks about the self elsewhere, that it was more he was claiming that it's an objective realm layered onto, but not spatially bound by the physical world. But I think using some of Jung's terms and his writings about kind of communicating with either the personal or the collective unconscious, it makes it more coherent or plausible for me to understand what he's getting at, especially the sense that it's not, the images and experiences aren't being generated by like the conscious volition or anything. um, so yeah, I like that language you used to describe it.
Yeah, so I think that's an important like distinction you bring up. In the work of Henri Corbin, the imaginal is seen as a plane of existence. So it's given some type of ontological status that is not solely or even entirely dependent on human consciousness. The idea is the imaginal is a realm in which we participate in, but it exists in some sense prior to and independent of our participation in it. Now, from the Jungian perspective, the language I use describing it as this kind of landscape of places in which you dialogue with different aspects of the self, there is a way in which those two have a meeting point in the middle, where in the Jungian idea of the self is not just you in this present moment, but it's sort of you in the past, you in the future, the whole totality of you. And I think if you externalize this psychology a bit, especially given a lot of the recent developments in cognitive science that look at the self as inactive and extended and embedded, you can exteriorize that psychology such that the self encompasses a landscape that includes intersubjectivity between you and between others, the kind of betweenness. Sometimes McGhilchrist talks about that idea of betweenness, which is something like an emergent whole that arises out of interaction between others. And so the imaginal kind of sits in a liminal zone. It's a boundary point. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's associated with religious experience. And that's why someone like Henri Corbin, who is quite powerful theologian, coined something like that, because there is a relationship of I guess the experience of numinosity that is often associated with liminal zones, spaces, boundaries between spaces, transitional spaces. And it became interesting to me because I encountered it in the context of an idea that I think has a lot of power, which is the notion of something being transjective.
Yes.
Which is something that sits between subject and object. It's a term that allows us to bridge between the subjective and the objective. Because, like Vervaeke argues, I agree that much of our current way, I guess the term Vervaeke would use here is cultural cognitive grammar, which is, of course, a fancy way of saying the way we make sense. Much of the way that we make sense is broken by a confusion about this distinction between subject and object. And on the one hand, you have people who feel that anytime someone emphasizes the subjective, they're retreating into a swamp of like relativist nihilism. And then on the other hand, people who emphasize the objective over the subjective, people feel that they're kind of like holier than thou, standing up from the heavens looking down, and then also disembodying and disconnecting, relations between people. And there's a middle way, of course, that I think we all intuitively grok in terms of our embodied experience, but is getting lost in translation when we bring up that embodied experience to the intellect. So the intellect is not able, under our current model, to integrate that. And I think the imaginal and the transjective are two ways to maybe perhaps help get our heads straight in relationship to our bodies. And that touches on a lot of themes I'm interested in, because in my own personal growth, one of the things I've come to understand is that from an early age, I've struggled with connection to the body and embodiment and getting the head and the heart in proper relationship with one another. And I think a lot of this conversation that's happening is about how we do that. And I think Vervaeke and Pageau, to give an example, have very different ideas about how we go about doing that. So it's interesting to play with those ideas, to see the wisdom in each and to see how we might arrange them together to select the best wisdom of both. So I don't know if that generates any thoughts, but that's my spiel about that.
Yeah, it reminds me again of McGhilchrist's work, where the more subjective and the initial presencing would be the right hemisphere, and then the kind of abstraction and supposed the attempt to get at objectivity would be the left hemisphere, and then maybe in some sense the imaginal and the transjective, which I do think have some overlap in their functionality, would be kind of the return to the gestalt of the right hemisphere, having integrated the left hemisphere's analysis and kind of dissection. And then I know Pageau has like the term incarnational thinking for this union, or the of heaven and earth, as he calls it, like the patterns of reality, which Corbin would say belong to the intellect, which is like the third or highest, most abstract sphere, and then earth being the body or the physical senses. And then in some sense, maybe you could see the joining as the imaginal or the transjective and the symbolic, which Corbin also speaks of as he talks of integrating those two other realms of cognition, um, which I also thought was interesting. I don't know if you want to go into that or if that sparks any thoughts.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I worry about going too much down that road because although I admire and like Corbin, I'm certainly not an expert in Corbin. And I worry that I might not really understand precisely like those two other realms of cognition, something I would like to look into. So something interesting that occurs to me, I guess if you were mapping Vervaeke's terminology onto Pageau's idea of incarnational thinking, it's almost as if the transjective is Christ, or Christ embodies the transjective more appropriately.
Yeah, like I think when Pageau talks about, I think using Maximus, the confessor, as each thing having a logos which binds its, I mean, in some sense, using the traditional terminology of form and matter together. But each thing has its own unique one. And I know you said you didn't know too much of Corbin's work, but I think what Vervaeke also uses from his work uh, would be related to the idea of the divine double. Like each thing has its own logos, its own divine double, which is simultaneously kind of its formal cause and final cause. Um,
It's a
and I think,
collapsing of that distinction.
yeah, in a sense. And I would be interested how that relates to the well, I know this is bringing in even more, but in Whitehead, there's the idea of the superjective lure of God, where in each actual occasion, there's a kind of the divine lure, which is kind of calling to the always legitimately partially free creature to move toward a direction of increasing complexity, unity, and intensity of experience. So I wonder if those three are all kind of related in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, well, so one thing I think is important because I always want to, as much as I can, take these ideas and concretize them, or at least to link them or bridge them to embodied experience. One thing that's interesting about what seems to be kind of like the phenomenology of a lot of sacred or visionary experiences is there does tend to be a sense of a beyond towards which one is in relation to. And often that relation is one of aspiration or one of pulling or being drawn. And one way I've heard this described, I think C.S. Lewis talked about this as his experience of his relationship to God. It was something like um, he was the mouse and God was sort of the cat, and he was trying to play like hide and seek or something, but the cat was always there, or something like that.
Hmm.
I'm fudging the analogy. Um, but it was basically the idea that he was always, in some sense, trying to run away from God, but God was always one step ahead of him. Um, this kind of thing pulling him towards some direction, towards some kind of end. And I think that partially explains the way in which so much of like religious revelation in many traditions posits some kind of final end, right? In Christianity, you have something like the second coming. In Judaism, you have the Messiah, right? The prophecy of the Messiah who will come to liberate. Um, and then, like even in the Quran almost like jumpstarts that and says, "All right, the end is here. This is our revelation. It's the end." There seems to be a regular tendency of that, and I think it might be related to the phenomenology of some kind of pull towards like as you I think as you described it's like a greater unity or cohesion with that divine element. And I guess the double is sort of like the aspirational image or the image of your aspiration, I guess, like the image of who you could become um, if you became all that you could become, so to speak. Which sounds a lot like Peterson, a little bit as I say it. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but there's something to that. I think that perhaps you could think of the transjective as a way of understanding how these different ideas are, I guess, how these different ideas manifest. So, and I think that bridges well with Pageau's idea of the incarnation. If we think of Christ as being a figure who embodies the transjective, which is to say the proper relation of the subject and the object, um, it allows you to incorporate both the personal and the impersonal in religion, right? And it allows you to manifest them. Because I think one of the ideas is that um, one of the things we notice is that there are some people who cleave to the personal in religion, and that causes them to fall into certain patterns of error. And then there are others who cleave to the impersonal, which also causes those to fall into other patterns of error, right? If you're overly impersonal in your approach to religion, it can make you cold, aloof, perhaps overly distant from like intersubjective experience. But then if you're overly personal, then you're getting enmeshment, codependency of various kinds, or I guess Daniel Siegel, he's a great neurobiologist. He talks about this as integration and differentiation. And I really like that terminology. And so he studies interpersonal neurobiology. And so he talks a lot about how it's important for us to navigate the relation between like being integrated kind of within, being solidly cohesive as a single self, and then also being differentiated in one's relationships, so that one self is not just contained in the boundaries of the skin, but is a sort of a flexible or fluid or dynamic relation between the integrated self and the world. And I think there might be a hemispheric relationship there to some degree, or at least the hemispheres would approach that in different ways. So this is a bit of a rambling response, but I guess in summary, I would say that I think the transjective is a way of understanding how, in some sense, the world stacks between different levels. How different levels of the world or different levels of being, if that's a meaningful idea, come together and come apart is through this kind of transjectivity. And then perhaps these other ideas are manifestations of that. I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I know Vervaeke talks about the combination of, or the optimal balance between integration and differentiation, also like efficiency and resiliency as complexification. And I think that also relates to Whitehead's superjective lure of each actual occasion moving toward greater complexification that is a balance between the integration and differentiation.
Yeah. So there's this actually dovetails quite nicely with an argument I am kind of working on. So this is very much speculative, but it'd be good to get your feedback on it. And it's definitely relevant to the conversation. In cognitive science, there is a lot of debate and discussion every few years about what the purpose of the brain is. It's something that comes up often. Lots of different neuroscientists and cognitive scientists propose different answers. The general, I don't think I can say there's a general consensus because there's so many different ideas. But I will say the general theme tends to be the importance of the brain for coordination. So bringing together, coordination of the body, bodily responses and behavior, but also, coordination of minds together, like cooperation. And what you emphasize, it seems, is based more on what your specialty is, whether you're, an anthropologist or a ethologist, right, or like an evolutionary psychologist. But the general thrust seems to be coordination. And I have an argument I'm working on, and I think the argument is something a little different, which is that coordination is a part of it. I think in some ultimate sense, what brains are doing when you incorporate kind of like the subjective element in addition to like the behavioral element is there is a sense in which I like to use this term realize that Vervaeke uses in the double sense he uses it. So like to make real, but also to cognize. And I get that my perspective is something like this, and I'm working on the way to phrase this properly, but this is what I have so far. It's the idea that the brain realizes a landscape of possibility. And in its realization, the landscape expands. So the landscape of possibility grows. It's not static or definite or limited in some ultimate sense. It's ultimately growing. And I would say, what say divides human brains from other animal brains or other organisms' brains is the rate of perhaps diversification, or the rate of the expanse of the landscape of possibility is dramatically higher in human brains, say, compared to like the brains of other organisms. Something like that. It's a very tentative idea. So I don't know what that generates for you, but I think the main motivation for it, or the main inspiration for the idea, is, I guess, the fact that as cultures evolve and change, landscapes of possibility open themselves up, right? And so possible experiences, possible ways of being, possible technologies, right? All of these continue to grow as cultures change. And by evolve, I don't mean evolve in a progress way. So I'm not making a progressive argument here. I'm not saying that there are cases where the landscape of possibility closes as well, but that the tendency is towards an opening of possibility. And that tends to be the general tendency. I don't know. I just think that's, it seems to fit very well with a lot of the subjective like experiences of, of just people in general, that there is this pull, right? Kind of like the divine lore that we were talking, the super lore, the divine that we were discussing. There seems to be this pull in a direction towards a greater expansion or openness. And it seems, in some sense, like really fundamental. Like Plato has the whole idea that like our need to be in contact with reality is kind of like a meta drive.
Yep.
Right? Vervaeke talks about that, and I think that is part of that. Is that reality is layered, and we kind of intuitively grasp that, right? When you're a kid and you put together a puzzle, the pieces are usually huge, right? But as you get older, the pieces get smaller and smaller, right? And so the layers and the complexity increase, even though it might be the same picture. It's the puzzle pieces get smaller and more complicated. So it's something like that. That there is this drive towards complexification to diversification, and the way I'm thinking about it is it's a realization, which is to say both a development of and a cognization of the landscape of possibility. And I mean possibility in a very broad sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That's kind of an interesting idea that I've been playing with for a while. And I don't know. I'm thinking about writing some kind of paper on it, maybe publishing it in the philosophical psychology journal, just to see like what people say. It's just like I'm kind of working on that as a side project, I guess, right now. So it might be a while before I have anything that is in a publishable state. But that's the basic argument, and I'm playing around with that. I really am just trying to explore areas in the cognitive sciences, maybe evolutionary areas, but then also like more present day areas to, I don't know, bridge that together. So that's what I'm thinking. I don't know what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's a lot in that overlapped with my intuitions as well. Are you familiar with Greg Henrique's work with the Tree of Life?
Yeah, so I'm not intimately familiar with it. I watched, I think, one of his lectures with Vervaeke, or not a lecture, but one of his videos. I think it was in the consciousness series where they delved into the model, and it seemed like there was something that aligned with my idea in that, at least towards I guess the latter half of the model when you're getting to the human level. Of knowledge, where there is this like complexification and diversification, and like it's kind of like almost like an asymptotic boundary, like it's a limit that's always being approached but never reached in some ultimate sense.
Yeah, and I think like language is the key factor that distinguishes the humans. Like his model starts with what the chemistry, and then goes to biology, life, and then cognition, so like encephalization of most animals with spines, and then the distinction for humans is culture, where there's the coordination of multiple minds through language, and that affords the increase in complexity outside the current time and place, through the symbolization. And I mean, he calls culture like a justification system for decisions, but basically it allows for coordination amongst groups as opposed to individuals. And both, like Pageau talking about this in terms of the principalities of like a city as being a unit, and then also more recent evolutionary thinking, and like David Sloan Wilson with group selection, multi-level selection, where groups will cooperate in order to compete, or individuals will cooperate to form a group that outcompetes other groups through language, culture, religion. So that allows for yet another stack of complexity. And then I know someone like Jordan Hall and Greg Enriquez and Vervaeke are talking about the potential, thanks to the internet, of the next layer in that stack, which obviously we don't know what it would be since we're not there yet. So that's highly speculative. But I think a lot of what you're saying makes sense. It does bring up the question to me regarding Corbin about the imaginal realm changing or evolving with culture, whether it does, which is one of the critiques I think I brought up with Pageau before, where because you mentioned it does seem as though there's new possibilities that arise through cultural change, and I agree that there's no new possibility without the closing down of prior possibilities in some sense, even if the overall total of possibilities is higher. So it seems to me that if the imaginal is, certainly if it's transjective, and then also if it like participates in human cognition or vice versa, then it would seem as though it would have to change somewhat. And I think the idea amongst a lot of the traditionalists, maybe, which I'm not that familiar aside from what we went through with Nasser, the idea that the realm, I guess the intellectual realm also, but that one perhaps makes more sense for like the basic constituents of physics, assuming they don't change, which maybe they do slightly. But the intermediary realm of the imaginal that Corbin talks about, I think, assuming that it's static in some sense, is what causes a lot of the like the pushback to new cultural forms, even though they should rightly be criticized perhaps for falling into too much of what McGhilchrist would say, like the left hemisphere overtaking the right hemisphere. But at the same time, that wouldn't neglect the possibility for new forms that would in some sense allow for greater complexification in a healthy way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's a really great segue. I'm wondering if there's a distinction here that needs to be made that is maybe getting left out, that would, I don't know, maybe perhaps help bridge these, I guess, different perspectives together. And one might be that, like, you have the patterns that the symbolic kind of worldview is built upon, and then you have the manifestation of the patterns. And I think the idea is that certainly as culture changes, the manifestations of those patterns change. So which players in the game represent which characters in the symbolic landscape changes as culture changes. And they change very frequently. It's a very dynamic kind of flowing process. I think the traditionalists, their perspective would be something more like, yeah, the manifestations are always changing, but the basic patterns are still always the same. So the idea would be like the patterns are perennial, whereas the manifestations are parochial, or something like that. Now, what is complicated here is that we're talking not so much about the manifestations of the patterns, but the landscape from which the patterns come.
Yeah.
Right? Like the source of the patterns. And then the question is, as our culture changes, as society changes, as technology changes, does the source from which these patterns arise, is that also shifting too? Is the nature of the landscape in which all of this manifestation occurs. Is there something about that that's different? And that is a very interesting question, one which I'm more sympathetic, I think, to your position, perhaps to a position that more or less someone like Vervaeke would argue, than I would be to the traditionalist perspective. Um, but there are certain things that I think the perennialists have right, which is to say there are certain kinds of problems that are eternal in some ultimate sense. And I think those are the problems that are best characterized by the ones that opponent processing systems address, right? So, there's always a need to balance integration and differentiation. And there's no optimum level that you can reach where it's static and fixed.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic process. I guess any process that requires dynamic change moment to moment to sustain itself is open to that perennial problem, or a host of those perennial problems, where there are never ultimately fixed values upon which you can land. There are only just adjustments that have to be made on an ongoing basis as experience and culture and society change. And so that pattern, I think, is the same. But how it manifests, which characters play it, in what ways, is always changing rapidly. And if there's any major critique I have of cultural conservatism, I think it's a confusion of the pattern or the manifestation,
Mm-hmm.
where there's an assumption that the manifestation of the previous generation is the same and was the same before and will be the same always in some sense. And it's kind of best characterized by the conservative person, not in a political sense, but the conservative person in a more like closed off, like, sticking to
Big five. Yeah.
It's I feel like it's best characterized by the person says, well, we've always done it this way, and so that's the way it should be. When historically that's almost never true.
Right.
I've always done it this way. It's like, no, you go by it far enough, it's almost never true, right? So that's a complicated question. I am open to the idea of the basic patterns changing. I guess the question would be then this: if the basic patterns did change, what would that look like? I guess how would we sort of understand that? I guess if we think of the imaginal as this intermediate zone between the subjective and the objective, what I'm thinking is that the relationship to or understanding of that relationship is what's changing, and how, I guess, what does that look like? I don't know, because I
Mm-hmm.
have like kind of a very abstract notion of that is not especially concrete in my mind. I don't know. So I'm curious if that juggles any thoughts.
Yeah, well, one thing I always think of regarding, for example, Corbin's idea of the imaginal realm is objective and in some sense separate, especially if you don't take the kind of mediating Jungian idea of it being part of the self. Is like, did that realm exist, and in what way did it exist? Like before Homo sapiens, for example.
Yeah.
And I know some people like Rupert Spira, for example, or no, Rupert Sheldrake, the guy who came up with the morphogenetic field theory,
Yeah.
argues that angels evolve. I haven't read his work, or I don't know what he means by that definitionally anyway, but so that would be an example, I think, of what I was proposing as a possibility of the change of at least the imaginal, maybe not the intellectual, like the physics patterns changing.
Right.
As for what that would look like, yeah, it's hard to say, but some of my comments on Vervaeke and Pageau's talk also were on similar things. Like if it requires a conscious, like, human participation in the pattern for it to manifest, then when that's not occurring or before humans existed, what is it doing? And then also, if you understand culture as like the next level in the stack of complexity, according to Greg Henrique's idea of the tree of life, as opposed to individual minds, then you can see the development of culture, at least not necessarily changing the patterns themselves, but as you are saying, the manifestation of the patterns due to either the communication medium for language changing, like from oral to scribal to print to electric to digital, or the physical environment changing such that the manifestation of the patterns look maybe to conservative temperaments as though the patterns themselves are being fiddled with when It's just that the context for the manifestation is so different that they require a different expression in order to function. And this is one of the critiques I make of like Pageau's thoughts on environmentalism, and one of his talks he did, where he basically implied that the wild itself has no value, like it's kind of potential out there that in the traditional societies they wouldn't have a reason to think, especially agrarian societies, that it was finite in a global sense, whereas we now understand that that is the case. And so a kind of resacralization in the animistic sense that hunter-gatherer societies, tribes might have done for like local herd populations, maybe whether you want to say it's eternally true or not, I would say it is, that they have some level of sacredness functional for the survival of that group.
Yeah, those are some really interesting thoughts. I'm wondering, there might be an analogy here that's helpful. Have you heard of like internal family systems therapy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it occurred to me as you were describing, like, I guess the different roles that people kind of like take on as culture evolves, that there might be an analogy here if we were to take, say, something like internal family systems, but project that to um, rather than an internal set of parts, like an external and internal set of parts. So you could think of human consciousness as one giant intersubjective whole, right? And then different, you could even think of different people and different movements as parts within the whole of all human consciousness. I'm wondering if that might help illuminate um, some of these ideas. What's interesting is there seem to be some important distinctions, and this gets into your comment on Vervaeke and Pageau's video, where they talked about collective intelligence and angels and the nature of consciousness in relationship to these things. Because I am entirely with Vervaeke. One of the, not suspicions, I guess criticisms I have of certain aspects of the traditional worldview is it seems as if though they impute consciousness onto things that only share in the consciousness of an emergent whole, which they themselves are not, because they could not participate in that emergent whole if they were a separate whole unique unto themselves, if that makes sense. So it's like my fingers is an example. I think the fingers was an example they used in the video. It's like my fingers respond to my conscious will, which is, you could think of that as an emergent whole of my relation to brain, body, and world, right? This dynamic, kind of thing, right? If they themselves were their own conscious wholes, they too would have like a kind of separate sense of self and identity that would then interact with mine, and it would then become this like I don't know what's the term I'm looking for, almost infinite regress, like, or infinite feedback, I guess, right? It would create a kind of feedback that would be incompatible with my coordination as an entire like self-individuated singular organism, right? Because it's like I've got lots of bacteria that are within me, so there's no
Right.
problem with all sorts of life, which may even have a conscious element within me, right? But the kind of consciousness that I think for like someone like Pageau is talking about, this sort of like self egoic kind of consciousness. I don't know, and perhaps maybe it's a Pageau has a different way of understanding consciousness in that sense. Is maybe like
Yeah, that's what I wonder.
consciousness, right? Just like raw experience, independent of a self that identifies or attaches itself to the experience. I don't know, but it seems that there was a little bit of confusion in Pageau's idea about like these kind of collective intelligences being conscious in some sense. Seems like there's a distinction that needs to be made there, because I think Vervaeke rightly pointed out that there is, it would suggest that these things only have existence that is like mediated by human beings.
Yeah, and in which case, when Pageau is talking about like the angel of a city, you can say that it maybe has a collective intelligence um, that is formed by the whole of the inhabitants, but then it wouldn't have it wouldn't be separable from the total, even though it's in
Yeah,
some sense more than the sum of the parts. But
Right.
even then, Vervaeke would say like that's like a temporary phenomenon, maybe at lower scales, like in a tribal dance or a rave or something, where or a dialogos. But then it would disperse afterwards. So, like Pageau brought up that Aquinas apparently said an angel is formed whenever two beings interact. But then when they stop interacting, maybe that's like a potential. But to describe it as like conscious temporally, I think it seems mistaken. Maybe if you have like an eternal view, at that moment, it still was part of that collective intelligence. But like Vervaeke calls it zombie conscious or zombie intelligence, where it's intelligent but not self-conscious in the same way, because there's a certain zone that consciousness requires to function, because it requires like the limitation in order to desire resources, which is the problem that AI researchers have for getting them to have common sense, to go through like a doorway or something, because they don't have limitation on their resources or they're not aware of it.
Yeah. One example where this is phenomenologically intuitive to me is like I used to do choir um, when I was a church attending person. And I loved it. And one of the things I noticed is that when a choir was really, really tuned in, where we were all really in sync with one another, um, there did seem to be that kind of experience, which people in, like Reiki talk about in Dialogos, where there's like almost this emergent third whole, that is more than just the interactions of our individual voices. And the thing is, it strikes me as highly unintuitive to describe that third emergent whole as an angel. Like, I'm deeply skeptical of it, right? Not because I don't think the idea has like poetic beauty, I think it does.
Exactly.
Um, but it almost seems like the idea is invoked because it has poetic beauty, not because it's plausible or coherent.
Right. That's my feelings basically.
Just because, like, the notion of angels I was raised with, that seems to be pretty common among religious traditions, is like angels are like kind of agents of God, which like pre-existed us before we were here and will pre and exist, after we're gone, right? And like if that's the case, then like does the angel die when the song ends? Like,
Right. That's my question. When you it seems like it's trying to have it both ways, or you're describing two different things. And I
right?
think the more traditional understanding is fine if you understand them as kind of eternal patterns of reality, which Pageau also talks about. But it seems to me he then talking about like Vervaeke's understanding of collective intelligence or the consciousness of a city. Um, well, like I said in my comment, you can see it as a
Yeah.
manifestation of that pattern, but it
Yes.
wouldn't have its own separate existence. So it could
Yeah.
poetically, it sometimes seems as though to get the poetic gestalt benefit, there's a bit of having your cake and eating it too, even though I understand the two aspects that are real that go into that poetic image.
Yeah, that the way you put that there, I think is very helpful for me. So I guess maybe to paraphrase that, it's maybe the debate comes down to this: there's a pattern, and then there's the way the pattern appears in the world, and you can take two perspectives. One perspective would be they're the same thing, and the other perspective would be they're different but related. And I think you and I are converging on the idea that they're not the same thing; they're different, but they are related. Um, Whereas maybe the more traditionalist point of view would be they're actually just kind of the same thing, the pattern of reality and its manifestation. And that might explain why a lot of religious folks, for example, who talk about like visionary experiences, like visions of God or of angels or of other beings, are so profoundly, how do I put it, um, certain that that experience is real in some ultimate sense that is independent of their consciousness. That it has a reality which is beyond it, and in some sense, of course, it does. Um, but I don't know. At least it suggests to me that there are differing intuitions on this matter, where you can see the pattern and its manifestation as the same or as different but related. And I think if your intuition falls more on the side of them being like the same thing, you're more likely to impute like some importance to the idea that there is a definite reality beyond just your participation in it. Um,
Mm. Yeah, but then it seems to me they're no longer like prioritizing or the primacy of the transjective, but once again they're doing the subject object split, which is very intuitive for us obviously, but it seems to me like with Whitehead's work and
Yeah.
Forrest Landry and Vervaeke, that the primary thing is in some sense the relation, which is very unintuitive. I don't know if your background would have anything to speak of there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can speak to that in a few ways. This is something McGhilchrist also says, like the
Right.
idea that relata or primary to I don't can't remember the term, but relationship is primary to relata. That's what it is. I guess like Pageau talks a lot about hierarchy, and there's a link here because everything in the study of like living systems, especially of the brain, suggests that the primary thing is not hierarchy but heterarchy. And heterarchy is a separate term from hierarchy, which implies top down, bottom up in a mutually interdependent feedback relation, right? So hierarchy would sort of be like you have a prefrontal cortex, which projects downwards to the limbic system, which projects downwards to the brainstem, which projects downwards into the rest of the body's nervous system, autonomic nervous system, right? All the neurons and the nerves that go throughout the rest of your body. And a hierarchical model would be basically like you know, top down messages in a linear path and then bottom up in a linear path up. So, an ascent downwards or an ascent up and a descent down. And that fits with the phenomenology of religious experiences as well, and also religious literature, metaphor, and art. You have Jacob's ladder famously in the Bible, right? The ascent to heaven. Blake had a revision of that McGhilchrist references, where instead of a straight ladder up, which is how it's usually depicted, he had a spiral, right?
I like that.
Which I like too. Um, Even that though, and this is something Vervaeke and Pageau have touched on. I'm surprised Vervaeke actually hasn't introduced the term heterarchy because I think it's relevant to that discussion. But they've touched on it in the sense that there's bottom up and top down. So there's emergence and there's emanation, and there's this dialectic, right? Emergence and emanation. They're kind of mutually interdependent. They co-arise. And Pageau would say, yeah, that's incarnation. It's the union of emergence and emanation, the perfect or proper union of the two. Um, and I guess my response would be that sort of takes the form of a heterarchy, like that proper union of emergence and emanation is heterarchical. It's not hierarchical. And if there were any place where I think I disagreed most profoundly with Pageau, it might be here. Although it's hard to say exactly because I'm not sure quite how he would respond to this if I were like to talk to him in person and be like, "Hey, what do you think of this?" Because part of me wants to say that if I said this to him, I think he would probably say that um, I'm abstracting too much in the sense that I'm not like understanding how this applies to lived experience.
Yeah, exactly. Phenomenologically.
And lived experience in the phenomenology, he would say, fits the hierarchical model better. I don't agree. Because I don't think in our lived experience, like, yes, we have mentors and we have, relationships of hierarchy all throughout, like, the animal kingdom, right? Not just in ourselves. And they're functionally very useful in some important sense, but these are not absolute hierarchies. Like, people always recognize that the hierarchies of, like, human beings are deeply functional. And people are more than happy to overthrow them when they're no longer functional, right? So there's always this sense, this underlying current of something that is more heterarchical, where there's, the person who is at the top of the hierarchy has a responsibility to those that are not at the top. And if they abdicate that responsibility, well, then they get overthrown and then the hierarchy changes. To me, that like mutual back and forth suggests something that is more heterarchical than hierarchical. That's, I don't know, my perspective. Maybe it's an issue of seeing things at a different level, perhaps, than Pageau is seeing them at. Because I do think, there's certainly a level of experience which is very hierarchical. So there's unquestionably, the hierarchy is part of human experience. And I would say the universe at large, if you want to expand this to metaphysics. But as much as hierarchy is, so is heterarchy. And if we abstract from human experience just to the way the natural world unfolds itself, it's totally heterarchical, and it's not hierarchical at all.
Yeah, and I think Pageau often acknowledges or emphasizes that the patterns of reality are fractal and that they apply at all levels. So, like Greg Henriquez, I think is useful here. And so, if you can show it at the biological level, I don't necessarily think he would deny it intrinsically. I think in some sense he's just using the word hierarchy to encompass some of the accurate aspects of what you're getting at. But I do think maybe just because of like the subconscious associations with the word, and because I think he feels a need to reestablish the necessity of it, he often goes too far down the road of like emphasizing the top down at the expense of the bottom up. Also because of kind of the left hemisphere scientism that just you can see like ticks him off clearly. But I think he doesn't quite account for a way in which the bottom up can reform the top down in a kind of organic and efficient way. Like he'll say, yeah, if the top down aspect is not functioning, then you're going to get a revolution. But it's never normative. Like his system seems to have no healthy way for there to be like what do I want to say, significant or fundamental reform. Like he tells the story of a nun who knew a priest was corrupt and keeping concubines, like barging into his room and then asking for forgiveness, but never directly acknowledging that there was a prostitute in the room. And I made the argument that to someone else I was talking to with that this maybe given the position of women at the time was perhaps the best thing she could have done in multiple senses for like not getting into trouble herself. But in our at least in our current culture, which I think has some benefits, like Charles Taylor on the ethic of authenticity, I think you can have a kind of respectful not just like criticism of corrupt institutions or leaders or authority, the top down aspect, but even things like nonviolent civil disobedience, for example, which I'm not sure his model like affords the possibility of, which I think is one of the problematic aspects of it, and maybe a lot of very conservative traditionalist institutions or hierarchies in general. And I would hope that the kind of, especially in the sciences like brain science and ecology, understanding of heterarchy would inform potential new more complex and forms of hierarchy or social organization that allow for more of a communicative relationship and reform from the bottom up.
Yeah, I'm in agreement there. I think that what I notice among those who buy into a similar model is there is a sense in which um, they might argue that one should prioritize the hierarchical structure over the bottom up reform. That when those are in conflict with one another, one ought prioritize that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the thing is, of course, very few people have the courage of that conviction in an ultimate sense, because if the top down becomes dysfunctional enough, then most people are like, all right, let's restructure. Um, but when you're thinking about more like low level social change, in the case of something like nonviolent civil disobedience, right? I can't imagine seeing someone like Pageau coming out in strong support of a movement that was predicated on that. You know what I mean? Like it would be a real surprise to me if he did, um,
Mm-hmm.
even if the cause was legitimate or something he kind of agreed with. And I think it's that understanding of the margin and the periphery. Um, the idea being that like uh, in some ultimate sense, the margin is necessary, but is still to be distrusted, because that's the role that the story, that's the way the story is supposed to unfold in some sense.
Yeah, I think he almost has a kind of what do I want to say? Like he conflates the margin and the center as a axis with virtue and vice as an axis. And to me, it almost seems like the center and the margin are kind of horizontal. Like the center is here and then the
Yeah,
margins are on the sides. But then the center can still be corrupt, so in vice, and then the margins can actually be virtuous, like the wise hermit in the forest who doesn't participate in society. And I think he would have to acknowledge that as symbolically
yeah.
valid. And that's why I think there's kind of a danger of equating or equivocating between marginal and like impure or sinful or whatever.
Here's what's bizarre about it is the ethic of Christianity, to my mind, seems to be the opposite, right? Like throughout the New Testament, the whole time Christ is saying, like, no, 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 the margin or the center is corrupt. Like the margin, blessed are those on the margin, right? Because the people he picks in every case are the people that are the most hated in that social group in that time period, right? He dines with tax collectors, right? You know, people who have betrayed their fellow Jewish citizens, you know, in favor of the Roman occupiers, right? Or like, you know, like prostitutes in that time period, right? Or so on and so forth. So it's a little bizarre to equate virtue and vice on the same axis that you have the center and the margin, at least if you're coming from a Christian perspective, because the Christian perspective in its most radical form is literally the exact opposite. It's like the center is vice and the periphery or the margin is like virtue. Um,
And I think that inversion is also a mistake, and that's his criticism of woke politics. And I think that's valid, but I think he's almost kind of over tipping too far in the other direction to compensate, because
yes.
he sees that as like the corruption of Judas saying we should give the money to the poor, not to wash the feet of Christ. But of course, he was wanting to keep the money for himself.
I
So
mean,
that's like a materialistic greed issue. But he's also saying the issue of trying to put the margin in the center is problematic, which yes, I agree. But without explicitly making it, he does seem to imply that the margins are also associated with vice and the center with virtue. And maybe in an ideal society that would be the case, I guess, that like the virtue is what's centered in the society. Um, but even then, it needs some critique because it's susceptible to egoism. And I think you can, like you were saying, the ethic of Christ working with the margins. It was also manifest in the centuries afterward with what I realized it was actually civil disobedience of the martyrs, you know, not worshiping the genius of the emperor. So I don't think you'd be able to deny that either. And I know he's had debates with like Anabaptists who think he's not, you know, revolutionary enough against temporal power. So
yeah, it's a very complicated issue about how you balance these things, especially, you know, as the manifestations of the patterns continually change. I think that like I do see that element of overcompensation to correct for like the woke version of Christianity,
mhm.
which I think does overemphasize the margin relative to the center. Part of it is that there seems to me the implicit purpose of Christ going to the margin in all of these stories is to redeem the margin.
Yeah,
Margin is what society has said is irredeemable or which doesn't deserve to be redeemed. And Christ says, no, 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 no. Everyone gets to be redeemed. And because society has cast you out, I am going to pay special attention to you. That's the idea of like the 99 sheep and the lost sheep, right? And, you know, he says like, you know, he goes out for the lost sheep, and then the other, you know, the person's like, what about these 99? And he's like, well, they're not lost. You know, like they don't need my attention. It's the sheep that's
yeah.
lost that needs my attention, right? And so this is something where I can see personally. I worry that when Christianity is over politicized, that becomes entirely about politics, which then quickly becomes about greed and materialism. And it very quickly turns into Judas wanting to take the money so he can help the poor, but he's really just keeping
Hmm.
it himself, right? And that, I mean, that's like, you know, modern leftist politics in a nutshell, right? A lot of, you know, it's a lot of the performative wokeism, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah,
change your Twitter bio pic.
yeah.
That helps. All right, you know, that kind of thing. So I see it. How you navigate that without falling into either of those traps, I think, from Pageau's perspective, would be Christ is the example of how to do that. Um,
Yeah, because he says he fills the hierarchy, which to those in the center will look like giving undue attention to the margins, but it's not as though they're trying to replace it. Like revolutions in general, I agree with Pageau, are typically not the best idea, but some kind of feedback from the bottom up is necessary for reform.
so I have a philosophical opposition to institutional Christianity for this exact reason, because I am convinced that institutional Christianity will always, by virtue of the way institutions are organized, become the Pharisees.
Yeah,
You know,
David Bentley Hart makes the same argument.
I think it will. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go to church if you so choose. Like, if you want to go to church, please go, right?
Right.
I think it's good that the options available for, communities of saints to commune together and to
Yeah,
help one,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
That is the way in many cases that the margin gets served is in the churches, right? That's where service to the margin happens often. But it's certainly not the only place it happens. And it certainly isn't the most profound place I think it happens, because it's just as much the case that there are many people in the margin that are served conditionally by churches, you know, in exchange for like attending or getting baptized or other
Mm.
things like that, right? You know, at least when the service is taking place within the church, right? So it's great when churches obviously go out to the community and stuff, and it's something I try and do as well when I can. Um, so it is a reason for me to have kind of a deeper rejection of even the idea of institutional Christianity. Like I think the arguments people make about Christ establishing a church when he, says, "Upon this rock, Peter, I build my church." I think those arguments are very thin, personally, based on the scriptural evidence they quote, which is really just that one passage. um,
Yeah, and I mean that alone, even if you accept it, doesn't necessarily flow out to all the details of like the hierarchical organization of what that will look like.
and how it should look. Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of this, I think it could also be indicative of my own bias, having come from like the Mormon church, because like that's as hierarchical as a church possibly can get.
Mm.
There are no churches that are more hierarchical than the Mormon church because every
Wow.
person has an active calling, and the callings are structured in levels from the local community all the way straight through to the very top, like the presidency of the church.
Hmm.
So the presidency has a quorum. That quorum has 12 people. Then that quorum oversees another quorum of 70, and there's 12 quorums of those 70 people. Those 12 quorums oversee all of the stakes in the world. Those stakes oversee the local bishops, which is basically the equivalent of a pastor for a local congregation, and then the bishops oversee every single calling for every single adult member.
Wow.
Yeah. So like as far as hierarchy goes, it's as hierarchical as it gets. And there's a lot of people in the church who would say something like, "When the prophet speaks, the thinking is done." That's a direct quote.
Hmm.
Uh, and so you can see why this was not ideal for me. Um, um, and so there's a bias there, and so I have to be cognizant of that. I mean, I think like Vervaeke, he's quite cognizant of the fact that he has his own bias that comes from his upbringing. Um, so yeah, but I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I We're probably going to have to bring it to a close here. I feel like we could talk for so much longer. Um, I guess in summary, I think the main things we kind of harped on has to do with that relationship between the imaginal and kind of like the divine double, the uh, the lure of God, the super or something. What is the term?
Superject. Yeah, Whitehead's idea of the superjective lure in each actual occasion toward greater complexity, unity, and intensity of experience.
And then maybe the relationship between those ideas and realization of possibility, and also
And the,
traditional, the I guess the ontology is there.
and the
uh,
transjective.
did you have any like closing thoughts or anything that you wanted to
There was one small point I
say?
didn't get to on your idea that
Yeah.
more conservative people about angels often equate the pattern with the manifestation of the pattern. It made me realize that that's almost a rather nominalist way to think about it, which is very anti-traditional in a sense, as opposed to the gradient of the very general abstract pattern and then the particular manifestation, which I think is more Platonic, more Neoplatonic, more accurate anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the way these tend to manifest, in terms of what people agree to or what they don't agree to, I think contradictions abound throughout. One of the things I noticed when I was first getting really into, say, something like, I had a period where I was really into panpsychism. The more and more I explored, the more I realized the limits of what I was exploring, and then all these internal contradictions. Like, I had one idea, like I had kind of the sense that consciousness was unique in its individuality in a subject, but also like, I guess they call it the combination problem. Like I ran
Mm.
into that problem with panpsychism, and I realized that my idea was like not really true panpsychism. It was just a bunch of contradictions, and I feel like that's been my experience of like just exploring these ideas in general. Like when I start to really land on one thing, it doesn't take long before I'm like, oh wait, there's a contradiction. Like there's one belief that I have that definitely doesn't fit with this. And so I think it's always a constant process of continual evolution, continual dialogue. Um,
Yeah, like I had the constitutive panpsychism idea where it was just a separate substance along with physical form. And then I listened to Bernardo Kastrup. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he has some good
yeah,
critiques as analytical idealist, which I don't necessarily agree with either. But then he, as apparently McGhilchrist, has kind of chastened his views to something in between, and I'm closer to McGhilchrist between the two again. Yeah.
yeah, I'm in a similar space. I don't know if you got a chance, but they had a long debate on this channel called Theories of Everything. Vervaeke and Kastrup. Did you ever
Yeah,
get
that was great.
I need to listen to it again. I've only listened to it once, but it was one of the best conversations on the topic I think I've ever heard. And I feel like I missed a lot of it, like the first time through, just because there were points where they were getting very technical. Um, and it was like, oh man, like I gotta slow it. I gotta like listen to this at half speed. Uh, but it was interesting to note how tense the conversation became at certain points.
Yeah, early on, I'd never seen Vervaeke close to mad, but he looked pretty fuming. I was shocked,
Yeah, he was like, no.
but it got better in their second talk. They were having a great time.
They were, and I think I want to go back and listen to it again because I sit somewhere in between the two of them, um, and I think I'm still somewhat persuaded by I think one of the points Vervaeke made, which was this idea of like, what do you get, or what gets added by choosing to label the whole of reality, all this stuff, including the what we call the inanimate, as experiential. Like what explanatory power does this give you in any meaningful?
Mm,
And it doesn't seem like there was a good answer to that, other than well, it's more parsimonious because subjectivity is our foundation rather than objectivity. Objectivity is the abstraction that comes out of subjectivity, and so that seemed to be the response, but it didn't really answer Vervaeke's actual question. Um, and so whether or not that's a problem for Bernardo's position or not is where I'm still uncertain.
yeah, I guess
Because,
pragmatically. Oh, go ahead.
well, just because ultimately reality at the bottom has to be a tautology, right? Um, which is to
Like
say, at a certain
eventually, we have to reduce to a monism.
something like that, right? Like at a certain level of explanation, you go beyond explanation, I guess, is something like
Mm,
that.
hmm.
And
Yeah,
it's the idea that all explanations rest on assumption,
yeah.
some level, if you go
There's
far
some
enough.
level of epistemic circularity because you have to trust your own memory and reason to make claims.
Right, and judgment, and just embodied experience of the world,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I need to go and listen to that again. And maybe that some of the ideas there could be a topic for a future conversation. And then maybe some more exploration of some of these ideas. There was a point I wanted to make about Jung and the transjective. I think a lot of what he does in the Red Book, I don't know if you've read it or not, he has a lot of these intervisionary experiences. And in one of them, he interacts with like a host of like the dead, which are like
Hmm.
symbolic projections of these people who need redemption because the religious teaching they had been offered in their life was not sufficient for them. So they were trapped in some sense. It's almost a little bit like the ghost whisperer idea. Like the ghost has unfinished business, and then
Hmm.
you resolve their psychological thing, and then they go off into the beyond, right? Um, that dynamic is playing out in one scene in the Red Book, and it's a series. It's called Seven Sermons to the Dead. Jung gives them a series of sermons where he offers them a metaphysics, a worldview that's complete where theirs was lacking, and it gives them the peace, so to speak, to like let go and move on, or to stop bothering Jung, because
Hmm.
the premise is they won't stop bothering him until he gives them this sermon. I think that insofar as the landscape of possibility changes, perhaps these kinds of visionary experiences change.
Yeah, I think so.
And I don't know if there's been empirical work on this. I doubt it because it would be somewhat difficult to conceptualize how to do it properly. But it makes me wonder if the kinds of visions or visionary experiences, even dreams that people have had, have changed over time, right? So like, in today's culture, I guess one example would be probably in today's culture, people have dreams with robots in them more often than people would have 50 years ago, right? And I guess you could think of that as a quasi-scientific way of tracking how the symbolic landscapes in people's inner consciousnesses are changing. Something like that, maybe.
Yeah, and that's a simple one that I'm sure is true, but I'm sure there's also more like formal shifts, especially based on maybe the communication paradigm of like people growing up with the internet as well, and social media.
This is a somewhat random question, but it might be related. Do you ever dream in cartoons?
Well, I've dreamt of characters that are fictional that I know of are, they're not live action.
But like
But I
just appear as cartoons like they would like in a cartoon show or a movie, like an animated cartoon.
oh, like it's appearing as a narrative before my vision and I'm not part of it, you mean?
No, no, not like that. I mean to say the characters look as in the same way as animated characters look like cartoon animated, like hand drawn animations, like Disney style animations.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like there's not a distinction in my dreams between that and supposed live action. It's almost somewhat in between if I think about it right now, but
Yeah,
I don't know.
I wonder about it because I was thinking about this the other day. I have a set of recurring dreams that are I guess my most common recurring dreams, and they're Harry Potter dreams. So, and they're always different. So it's not the same dream. It's
Hmm,
just in the same universe with
interesting.
the characters. Often I am a character in Harry Potter, or I'm myself, but just transposed into the Harry Potter universe and participating. Um, and it's all different plots, different stories, different things like that. Um, but I had the thought to myself, um, as a kid, I was a big, big Disney kid, and so like I just lived on Disney as a child. And there's a couple of Disney movies that have always been really profound for me. Lion King is one of them, just because I think Rafiki was the first sage figure I ever encountered.
Nice. Nice.
He was my first sage, and the sage has always been kind of like my north star in life. It's the archetype to which I aspire.
Yeah,
Um, first time
same
I
here.
had an experience of psychedelics, I had almost a quasi vision of that. It was almost as if it was like telling me that could be you, but get to work. So I was like, oh man, um,
Yeah.
I love and hate the archetype because it's intimidating. I think um, because I come up against a failure in some ultimate sense all the time, or just the gulf. As I learn more, the gulf between who I aspire to be and who I am in the present seems to be ever increasing. So there's a little bit of a kind of despair in that. Um, but of course, I comfort myself with the knowledge that wisdom is not a thing that you ever attain or reach. So
Yeah.
it doesn't even make sense to pose it in that way. In fact,
Right.
the fact that I'm posing it in that way is a sign of the lack of it.
Right. That would be like the left hemisphere as opposed to a movement toward that direction.
Yeah, yeah. So I try to remind myself where I can that it's the journey that takes precedence.
I was interested in what Corbin would think of lucid dreams, especially where they're not being generated by the will in terms of the imaginal realm. Um,
I
or
wonder,
if he ever wrote about that.
I don't know if I wouldn't be surprised if he's addressed it. Although lucid dreaming is a relatively newly described phenomenon in terms
Hmm.
of like psychological science. So I don't think when he was writing they had a term for it yet, like a formal
Hmm.
term. But certainly people had written about it. Like lots of people have known about it for thousands of years. And like the Tibetan yogis have this whole dream yoga that you do, which
Oh yeah, yeah.
the lucid dreaming technique. Um, I wonder if that, to me, it strikes me as a way that you might more intentionally practice something like internalizing the sage, almost like in an active imagination sense. Like you go into a dream, maybe you meet a sage in your dream, and you speak with them in the dream, right?
Yeah,
When
I
I
can see that.
I don't really have a well-developed visual imagination. I'm pretty sure I'm aphantasic entirely because I can't generate any visual imagery in my minds.
Really? On command you can't?
I can't do it at all. It's
Oh,
just
jeez.
actually the only time I ever have that is in dreams. I have it
Huh.
nowhere else in my experience. But what I do when I do active imagination is I do it through writing. So I imagine myself in dialogue with another person, another part of myself, or like another. Sometimes I've actually imagined myself in dialogue with like Gandalf because I really like Gandalf, and I play with that, you know. And some interesting things happen when I do. It's one reason why I really like poetry because that's kind of how I get into my right hemisphere mode, especially because like I would probably say I'm overly verbal in my orientation, so it's a little easier to do that. So I don't know. That's kind of my experience of it. But yeah, no, I have no inner visual image whatsoever. Never have. In
Interesting.
fact, for the longest time, I didn't even know people did.
Oh, I've always had the ability to like, or I would have very vivid battles in my head between creatures growing up, like a Pokemon or something, and then I'd kind of act it out a little bit visually, and then I'd have my hands fight each other, and then I'd each have different elemental things on each finger, very, very vividly. And then more recently, I was practicing kind of projecting myself onto a landscape that I would see, like if I'm outside, and then imagining myself like running through it, climbing, jumping things, practicing parkour moves to train
Mm.
mentally, and then I'd be able to do the sensation of like grass or metal or wood would I would be able to feel that fairly vividly. So yeah, I'd be curious what Corbin or you with your academic background would make of that ability to. It's mostly touch, not so much the other ones, but I can generate the other senses largely as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it becomes complicated because I Corban associates like this imaginal realm, I think with largely with like visionary experiences, the kinds of experiences that like mystics and sages have. And when he talks about it, it's mostly in that context, but he also talks about it in dreaming because he says that dreaming is the imaginal realm. So that's kind of like from his point of view how ordinary people get into the
Hmm.
imaginal realm is through their dreams, and that the sages and mystics can kind of do it on command in their waking life, or there's
Hmm.
less of a distinction there. Um, and it makes me wonder, what his thought would be about people who are naturally very gifted at kind of inner sight in that way that you are, right? Where they kind of play around with those things. Because there's certainly a conscious will that is being strongly used in those exercises, right? Like it takes a certain degree of attention and focus that has to be pretty well developed to like do that and keep a consistent visual image over time, and to also shift the visual image while preserving the rest of it, right? Um, so I don't know how well that fits or doesn't fit with his idea of the imaginal. Um, I think he would probably lump that more into the category of fantasy rather than the imaginal, because in him,
Mm.
because I think the imaginal for him has a certain kind of structure, and so it's like imagine you have like a landscape of inner experience, and it's like if you land on the right structural maybe invariance to use a science term. There's certain structural invariance of inner experience which corresponds to planes within the imaginal realm. It seems to me he's making an argument like that,
Yeah.
and people land on those or can land on those, but typically don't without some kind of like prolonged training in a mystical tradition of some kind, which feels a little exclusive to me.
Yeah, a little.
Uh, but maybe there's something to that. I mean, I certainly think that when people are trained in a tradition, they tend to constellate around a particular kind of inner experience by virtue of the training. And I would say that has more to do with the training than it has to do with the objectivity of the supposed inner realm.
Hmm. And
Because
the shared symbols and culture that they're immersed in.
because then it's quite difficult to reconcile the diversity of inner mystical visions across cultures
Right.
in terms of like the structure of the visions, but also the content and
Yeah.
and the temporal order. Like they're all exceedingly different from one another, far more different than they are similar. Um, Even though there are patterns that are the same, the number of those patterns is significantly smaller than the differences. Um,
Well, and the appearance of their manifestation being culturally contingent.
yeah, but it makes you wonder too because like if you take something like the near death phenomenon where often people encounter meeting people. And sometimes they encounter meeting a sage. Sometimes in some cultures it's described as Christ, others it's described as Buddha, others it's described as Muslim. What's common across those is the meeting of a sage, right? And so there's lots of ways you can interpret what that means. One way I understand it is that you are in a kind of projective, transjective, imaginal sense, you're encountering your aspiration in a concrete form.
Yeah. And I did like how, feel free to interrupt me if you need to go at any time, how Corbin said that the imagination is firmly balanced between the other two cognitive functions, and symbolizes the world that the others, sensory knowledge and intellective knowledge, correspond to. So it's kind of like a control that keeps the imagination from wandering into fantasy, which I like because it reminded me of Vervaeke talking about like the governing and then the enabling constraints. But then it brings up the question, like the fact that the physical sensory aspect, which he argues is present in the imaginal, but it's like all one thing somehow. It seems essential for the imaginal to properly function. And so, like, why would the physical or sensory exist at all if it's not in some way necessary and interdependent with the other two cognitive functions? And then, like I guess you could say the imaginal and intellective exist as potential without the physical, but they're only actualized with the physical senses. Like does the experience that I have projecting myself into a field and feeling the experience of grass and metal, would that not just be, would that only be possible because I have a memory of those sensations in my past physical experiences? Like if someone, for example, was kept in a room of soft fabric,
Right.
would their imaginal experiences have the potential for sensory things beyond that room?
Yeah, could they have an imaginal experience of the grass under their feet?
Right. That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there are certain things where the answer to that question would be yes, and others where the answer might be no. And so, like, just as an example, you can take like mice, for example, that are like raised, let's say, in an isolated environment, like I don't know, laboratory room, so they've never been outside, and then you take the odor of a cat and you put it in the room, and they freak out and panic, right? So there are certain things that are like
yes, for sure,
sort of wired. So it makes me wonder if something like I could certainly imagine that you might project or imagine the feeling of grass under your feet and can still have that experience if you've never experienced it in real life, but it might not take the same shape that the real life.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so I mean, I think people do this a lot. This one's kind of funny, but I used to do this in school all the time, where I was bored or waiting for something. Usually after a test was done, and I was just waiting for the rest of the class to finish. I'd be like sitting there, and I'd be like imagining, all right, the shooter comes in. What do I? And the fantasy, of course, was always absurdly unrealistic because it involved me doing some flying kung fu karate chop across the room, narrowly avoiding all the bullets, and then pulling the gun from him and then punching him to the floor. But like those visions or those imaginative fantasies had a lot of like intense emotion attached to them, and although they weren't visual in nature, in my case, they had intense feelings with them. So, like for example, I was talking to a friend once about the aphantasia thing, and he was like, and we both love fantasy, and he was like, wait, so you're telling me when you read a book, it's not like a movie in your head? I was like, no, it's not a movie in your head. And he was like, that sounds terrible. Why do you even enjoy reading? And I was like, well, I mean, when I watch a movie on a screen, it's not in my head exactly. I'm not seeing the movie again in my mind's eye. I'm just seeing it. And as I'm seeing it, I'm experiencing the emotions. So it's really just like when I'm reading, I experience all the emotions. And that's why I enjoy it. It's the emotions, that I feel as I'm reading. I don't need there to be like a movie in my head to enjoy it. That was kind of the way I explained it. So like for me, when I do imaginal stuff, I do it kind of in that way where I feel the emotions rather than having a vision. That being said, I do have a very strong inner voice. And I can kind of like change the inner voice. So like in my mind's eye, like the difference between my voice versus my mom's voice. Like I can imagine my mom's voice in my head and hear it
Hmm.
as her voice, or like someone else's voice. When the that movie The Martian came out, I read the book in Matt Damon's voice, and it made the experience more fun.
Yeah, I do like doing that with characters in a book, like what an audiobook will often do for you with different speakers. But that's much harder. I have to focus much more on that than the visuals. I still have to focus a little bit on either, but it does enhance it for sure.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, the voice will often trail off into my own voice if I don't keep focusing on it. And as far as your idea of like certain things being innate, I think also for example, like trees might be visually innate just because they have such an important evolutionary heritage for us. And I know people like on psilocybin will see more nature oriented visions, which might be kind of activating those kind of archetypal
yeah.
forms.
Well, it's also true that blind people still dream in many cases, and they see things in their dreams they're unable to see in their waking life, which would suggest, um, at the very least, like uh, that there are aspects of the visual cortex that are able to like project to your association areas in the brain,
Yeah.
that still can create consciousness of vision, even if you don't have any vision because your eyes aren't working properly.
And then vice versa. I don't know if you remember Bernardo Castro talking about the big example he uses for his theory of the woman who has multiple personalities. One of them is blind, her eyes are functioning. The part of her brain that sees shuts off when that arises and she can't see.
Yeah, there's another thing similar to that called, I guess it's cortical blindness, where it's actually brain damage to the cortex.
Okay.
The eyes work, and the people are able to navigate in the world without seeing. So, like,
Hmm.
they'll walk in a path and they'll avoid an obstacle if you put an obstacle in their way, but they will never claim to have seen the obstacle. And like,
Wow.
you'll have the patient, you'll say like, okay, just walk over this way, and they'll be kind of nervous because they can't see anything. They're like, I don't want to hit anything, and they're like, don't worry, you won't hit anything, and then they'll avoid the object. And sometimes they'll do really dramatic versions where like they'll put something like in the whole way of like a doorway that they have the person walk through, and the person will like lean against the wall, squeeze past it, and then afterwards the person says, "Why'd you do that?" And he says, "They always are like, I don't know, I just felt like walking that way."
Wow. So what are the eyes for then if they can't see through their eyes?
um, well, no, they are seeing through their eyes. It's the cortical blindness.
Okay, okay. So they don't recognize the fact that they
There's no
are.
conscious percept.
Okay. Okay.
Right? So it's
Okay.
vision without consciousness of vision.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like the eyes are intact, but
Okay.
the visual cortex is damaged beyond kind of repair, and so they are
That
unable
makes more
to,
sense.
yeah, have a conscious experience of vision. So I mean, it's great because it dissociates a sensory experience from the consciousness of that sensory experience, and that distinction is fundamental to understanding consciousness. Like
Yeah.
it's like it's the main way experimentally people do it. They use a technique called binocular rivalry, where what happens is, when you kind of like, you have the two eyes and they integrate the vision together. But if you put one image and you project it to one eye, and the one image you project to the other eye, and you separate them, so one eye sees one image, one eye sees the other, what happens is you don't see both images at once. You switch back and forth. So you see one,
Hmm.
then you see the other. You see one, then you see the other. So what they do is they put people through that paradigm. Then they look at brain activity. How does this shift when you go from one image to the other? And they look at shifts in brain activity, because the idea is that you can locate the neural correlates of at least visual attention or visual awareness of the percept, because it's the same percept. The percept is never changing. Like the visual
Right.
percept is never changing. It's just the perception. So then you can say, well, the only brain activity that changes in this paradigm, we can localize that and say that is a neural correlate of consciousness in potential. The challenge is it's really hard to do that, to identify the brain activity that changes only in that context and not in any others.
Hmm.
Because how do you know it doesn't change in any others? You have to do like a bunch of different like controls and things like that. Um, but that's a way that people, from a neuroscience perspective, study consciousness. They try and do things like that, so they can identify neural correlates. Of course, this has nothing to do with solving the hard problem. So but the scientists are just like, it'll happen eventually. I'm,
Yeah.
I'm more skeptical, but
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I kind of like ultimately the idea that at bottom there's an irreducible mystery to the world, and that we're continuous with that mystery. And I think if to the degree that we are continuous with that mystery, if that's the way reality stacks, it would be in the fact of consciousness, of the fact that there is at all a subjective experience that is somehow in relation to something which doesn't seem to also be subjective, but maybe it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where I'm at, but I don't have all the training to make me more interested in trying to find it out. So it's easy for me to just say, oh, it's well, at root, it won't be solved, but I still admire like Greg and Vervaeke having that whole series circling around, getting closer to the hard problem.
Yeah,
That was amazing.
that I think was probably my favorite set of Vervaeke videos I saw this year. It's another set I'd love to go back and rewatch. I went a little bit longer, but it worked out because no one came in to interrupt us, which I thought they would.
Oh,
It worked out really well.
nice.
But it was just, there was too much there that was just of interest. So I'd love to talk about this more, and to expand some of these topics at a later point. So I'm sure we'll set that up probably sometime mid-semester. I'll reach out to you. But yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
once I'm done, I'll edit this video and send it back to you within a week, and we'll both post it. And who knows? We'll see what happens.
Yeah, sounds great.
Sounds great. It was good talking to you.
Yeah, you too, Mackenzie.
Bye.
See ya.